Hi everyone, this is going to be the first episode of a new series that I'm starting called Meet the Professor. In this, I'm going to be interviewing professors from different universities on their research, why they pursue philosophy, and general advice they have for people wishing to pursue it. So, this is going to be the first episode, and thank you for watching. Hi everyone, welcome to today's interview. To all of our viewers, I want to first introduce our guest today, Professor Duncan Purves. He is a professor of philosophy at the University of Florida, where he focuses on issues of environmental ethics and artificial intelligence used in war and policing. Thank you for agreeing to speak with us today, Professor Purves.
My pleasure.
Okay, so to begin our interview, I'd first like to ask a couple of broad questions about philosophy generally before we dive into some specifics about your work. Why do you think that people, students in particular, should pursue philosophy?
I think one reason to pursue philosophy is that um, if my experience as a student and later a graduate student was any indication, I think that it uh, shows a lot of students who maybe didn't get this experience in high school that there is an entirely different set of questions that you can ask about the world and the nature of the world, the nature of our values, the foundations of our politics that we didn't even realize you could ask. Um, and I remember when I went to college, that was what struck me most about my first philosophy classes, is that I didn't even know we could ask these questions. And not only that, but philosophy sort of provides you a unique way of trying to answer those questions. And I think it actually provides a kind of methodology that allows you to make progress on those questions, and maybe not arrive at a perfectly decisive answer, but at least give you a sense of how you might try to answer some of those questions. Um, I think more instrumentally too, it provides some tools for thinking more critically about some of your other coursework, um, some of the topics that you might encounter in an economics course or a political science course or a sociology course. I think it allows you to think a little more deeply about any sort of topic that you might encounter in your academic pursuit. Um, and then lastly, uh, it's a pretty well established fact at this point that philosophy students perform the best on certain standardized tests, including the LSAT, including tests for law school, stuff like that. So I think there are lots of good reasons to get into philosophy, and it's interesting.
Yeah, those are definitely a lot of really good reasons. So for you in particular, how did you specifically get interested in philosophy? Or like what was your first introduction, kind of?
Yeah. So when I was a freshman in college, I took an introduction to ethics course, big in a big lecture hall, and it was like at 8 a.m. in the morning, which was tough, for a freshman in college. And that course was actually terrible. I That was not why I got into philosophy. But that was my introduction to it. It was, I won't say who taught it, but it was just not very interesting. That they kind of taught the course like you would any other course. You just stood up there and talked for an hour and then you left. But the second course that I took was a political philosophy class with a professor named Brian Kierland. And this was at the University of Missouri. He's at the University of, or I think he's at Boise State now. Um, but that class just, sort of blew my mind, for lack of a better word or phrase. The course focused on um, contemporary, so by contemporary, I mean, 20th century theories of political authority and political obligation. So, why are citizens obligated to obey the laws of the state, and what gives a state authority to coerce its citizens into obeying those laws?
Mm.
Right. And so I remember that one of the philosophers we spent a lot of time on was Robert Nozick, famous libertarian political philosopher. And I just found both Professor Kierland's sort of engagement with the material, but also the material itself, just so fascinating. I don't know if you've read Nozick's stuff, but it's his arguments are so clear. They're so he doesn't, he doesn't use any sort of fancy language. He's very straightforward, but his arguments are so clear and they're so compelling, and you're sort of left at the end of every chapter wondering how you could, sort of possibly refute what he has to say, right? And yet he's arguing for these pretty surprising conclusions um, about political authority. So I just found that class fascinating, and that's when I sort of realized that we were doing that philosophy was up to something really interesting and something that you couldn't do in any other discipline. I mean, no other discipline's even trying to answer these questions. So that's when I changed my major, I think, at the end of that semester.
Okay. So yeah, so I definitely read some of Nozick's evidence in like debate rounds and things like that, and they've had great success with them. So for other books or like other publications, other papers, other podcasts, what would
Yeah.
you recommend that people who are interested in philosophy or want to pique their interest read into or listen to or things like that?
So I'm just going to provide you with a list of some of the ones that I thought that sort of resonated most with me in grad school. This is not the whole gamut um, uh, by any means. There are lots of areas that I'm not going to cover. Um, and most of these are focused on ethics, although not all of them. So I actually have them right here.
No.
So one book that I think is great just for like, um, a first year college student who just wants to sort of get a sense of what kind of questions philosophers are asking. I think this is a great book by Thomas Nagel. Thomas Nagel is now retired, but he has had a lot of influence in all sorts of areas of philosophy, including philosophy of mind, epistemology, ethics. So this book's just called "What Does It All Mean?" It's a tiny book. It's super short, but he just does kind of a quick survey of different issues in philosophy. I taught, how does one know anything? The problem of other minds, the mind-body problem, what do words mean, free will, right and wrong, all this stuff. It's just a great short survey, and he's a great writer, very clear. Another cool book that I think is really interesting is called Living High and Letting Die by Peter Unger. I'm not sure if you've read this one, but it's basically, if you're familiar with Peter Singer's arguments from Famine, Affluence, and Morality, the conclusion of his arguments is that we should all be giving a lot more to help people in need than we actually do. Peter Unger takes this to the absolute extreme, and argues that we should be that not only should we be giving most of what we have to helping others in need, but we should probably be stealing from other people to do it. So he takes it to a very logical extreme, and it's just great. It's a great piece of sort of provocative analytic philosophy. So that's squarely in sort of applied ethics. Um, this book is probably a little more challenging technically. It's a little more theoretical, and it's a lot more uh, engaging with sort of very contemporary, sort of cutting edge questions in ethical theory. But this is a book by Ben Bradley, who's a professor at, I think, Syracuse University, called Well-Being and Death. This book is really in my wheelhouse. A lot of my research is in this area. And basically what he's trying to provide an answer to two questions. One is, what is it that makes our lives go well for us? And the other question is, what is it that makes our deaths bad for us? And he thinks those two answers, he gives sort of a nice systematic set of answers to those questions. It's a great book. He's a super clear writer. He's very careful. It's just a great display of philosophical talent. That's sort of ethical theory stuff. Another book is Ethical Intuitionism by Michael Huemer. He was one of my advisors in grad school. He is somewhat of a, maybe controversial figure is too strong, but he's a pretty staunch libertarian. So a lot of his political philosophy is in that vein. He argues against gun control. He argues in other works, not in this one. I think he argues against a minimum wage. He also argues against any sort of immigration restrictions. So he's a really interesting guy. But in this book, he's concerned with metaethics. So the book is called Ethical Intuitionism. He's defending a view that he calls ethical intuitionism. And that's basically the view that there are objective moral facts about the world, and we can come to know what those moral facts are through a faculty that he calls intuition. Um, and it's just great. He spends a lot of time sort of trying to refute objections to this view, because a lot of people are very skeptical about this view. But it's a great, if you're interested in sort of that question, how can we come to know anything about moral properties or moral facts? What are moral facts? He tries to give some answers to those types of questions. I got two more. Another book is Naming and Necessity by Saul Kripke. This is another short book, but it's maybe one of the richest pieces of philosophy that you could ever read. It's in the area of philosophy of language. So he's interested in questions like, what do our words mean, and how is it that we refer to things using them? So when I say, when I talk about Arjun, how is it that I am talking about you,
Mhm.
right, and not some other person? And so he has a great set of arguments. An interesting thing about this book is that apparently this entire book is just a transcription of a series of lectures that he gave, and he gave those lectures without any notes.
Mhm.
So this is just a book that he had in his head that he just produced over the course of a series of lectures. So Saul Kripke is now, I think, retired, but he was definitely an important philosopher in the area of philosophy of language. And then the last one is just another short book called The Problems of Philosophy by Bertrand Russell. Um, this book is primarily interested in knowledge, the question of epistemology, right? How it is we come to know things about the world. But it's just it's very short. Again, he's a very clear writer. And he sort of gives a little account of how it is we come to know anything in this short and interesting book. So that's it.
Yeah. So now that those definitely sound very interesting, and I'd love to take a look at them. But so now that we've discussed a little bit of like other people's work and other people's research, I wanted to delve a little bit more into your work and your research.
Yeah.
So I know that you've done a lot of work on the environment and its ethics and its value. Could you briefly summarize your research into that?
Yeah. So the environmental stuff. So my work on the environment, these days I'm doing less stuff in that area, but most of my work in environmental ethics concerns questions about intergenerational justice. So so my dissertation topic was something that's called the non-identity problem. Um, and the non-identity problem is sort of a problem that was sort of discovered or articulated um, in the early 70s, really, 60s and 70s, by a few philosophers that seem to kind of come upon it independently. But the basic problem is this. um, a lot of us think that we should curb our carbon emissions, we should drive less, we shouldn't pollute, we shouldn't throw trash on the ground. And a big reason for this is that it's going to harm future generations, right? We should do it for the sake of future people. Um, but the non-identity problem arises for this kind of natural, intuitive position because, as it turns out, a lot of the actions that we perform now are going to affect not only the quality of life of future people, but also who comes to exist at all, right? So just to take a simple example, right? If somebody decides that they, for the sake of the environment, they want to start taking the bus to work instead of driving their car, right? Well, they have to leave, like a few hours earlier every day, or whatever, a few minutes early every day, or maybe 30 to 40 minutes early, right, depending on the bus route, to get to work on time. And the same for going home. So their entire weekly schedule changes. And what ends up happening is that this person, as a result of this choice, ends up, um, uh, suppose that they and their partner decide they want to conceive a child, right? Well, as it turns out, their conception schedule ends up being very different than what it would have been had they not made this choice to start taking the bus to work, right? Um, uh, Now, what this means is that in this scenario, a different sperm and different egg combine, right, at a different time than they otherwise would have, right? And so, insofar as our identities are intimately connected to the particular sperm and egg that we are conceived from, and the timing of our conception, and then all of the experiences that result from that event, it's very likely that that person has a different child than they would have had they not, say, started taking the bus to work. Now, that's just a simple example. But imagine all of us, or like imagine a national policy, right, change, an environmental policy change that changes the way that all sorts of people go to work, go to the grocery store. This can affect where people move, who they meet, who they conceive children with, and so on, right, for generations. Well, the thought is, what looks like a simple environmental policy will have this result of changing the identities of many future people. Okay, why does that matter? Well, why it matters is that if what we're trying to do is we're trying to avoid harming future people, right, with our environmental policies, well, one thing we have to reckon with is that those policies are not only going to change the quality of life of future people, they're going to change who exists. Okay. And so the people who will exist if we have a very wasteful, environmentally unfriendly policy going forward, right? There becomes a question about whether those people can now say, you have harmed me through your wasteful actions, because had we adopted a more environmentally friendly policy, it's very possible those particular people wouldn't have existed at all.
Mm-hmm.
So they're arguably not worse off than they would have been had we chosen the environmental conservation route. So that's the problem. So how do we explain why it is we should be adopting sort of environmentally friendly policies and so on, in light of this fact that the future people who will exist may not exist
Mm-hmm.
if we adopt environmentally friendly policies? How do we explain our reason to save the environment in terms of future people? So that's the basic puzzle. And in my work, I try to give a sort of solution to that question, or a solution to that problem, an answer to that question. But that's a lot of what my environmental work has been on.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense and like sounds very interesting. I know
Cool.
you've also done a lot of research into like the ethics of artificial intelligence. How do you think AI and all of its manifestations will challenge our traditional conception of what ethics means?
So yeah. um, I mean, so in some sense, um, I think there are a couple of different answers there. On the one hand, far down the road, long, perhaps many years from now, I do think that the artificial intelligence might pose a challenge for our concepts of personhood, or what it is to be a moral patient or a moral agent. That is, what it is to be someone whose interests matter for their own sake, right? That we should consider for their own sake. Um, it's certainly possible, and there are plenty of TV shows that are sort of giving us a little glimpse of this future already, right? Uh, but it's very possible that we're going to, at some point, achieve a level of artificial intelligence, general artificial intelligence, where we actually have to ask whether or not this thing has consciousness, has feelings, has beliefs, has desires. And I do think that the development of AI will eventually challenge our concepts of the person and moral patient in that respect. I don't think we're anywhere close to that now, but someday we will. I think we might very well face that possibility. Um, Perhaps more immediately, though, the more interesting the more interesting features of artificial intelligence for philosophers and ethicists are actually some of the ways that um, computer scientists and statisticians are actually thinking about concepts like fairness. Um, so what you're seeing a lot more of, and what I've been thinking about in my own work, is you're seeing a lot of computer scientists try to develop ways to measure fairness, or to quantify fairness in artificial intelligence systems. And so a lot of the interesting work right now is sort of trying to understand what computer scientists have in mind when they develop these measures of fairness, and what it is, what sort of moral features of the world these measures are supposed to be picking up on, right? So apparently there are at least 11 different measures of fairness in AI systems that computer scientists are working on. But I think a lot of those are sort of underexplored. The sort of the moral grounds, the moral foundation of those measures is really underexplored right now. Um, and they matter a lot because there have been prominent examples, like in the ProPublica article called "Machine Bias," that revealed apparent racial disparities in classification of defendants by an AI system. This system apparently disproportionately mistakenly classified Black defendants as high risk of reoffending compared with white defendants, and this seems to be unfair. But according to other measures of fairness that computer scientists use, the system actually wasn't unfair. And so disentangling this stuff is really important, because it's going to determine our policy going forward for AI systems. So that's something that I'm really interested in right now.
Okay, yeah. So another manifestation that I know you've done work into is like autonomous weapons and autonomous and predictive policing. How do you think we can ethically design these systems, or even whether they can be ethically designed to ensure fairness, to ensure justice, and all of these important values?
Yeah. Um, so yeah, I mean, it's a great question. I mean, going off of the what I just said there, I mean, one core requirement of um, of an AI system that's being used in the public domain, particularly in criminal justice, is that it treats everyone equally before the law, right? So equal treatment before the law is sort of taken to be sort of an ethical and also legal requirement of our criminal justice system. Um, so one thing that you need to watch out for in the predictive policing case is any sort of inequality with respect to the way that the law is being administered. So if a predictive policing system exacerbates that inequality or any kind of inequality, then that is probably a moral reason to revise the system or to stop using it. Um, I do think that one problem there is that it's not exactly clear what equality before the law means in the case of predictive policing. I think that's somewhat underexplored. Um, Another key component that I've been working on recently of AI systems is I think that AI systems in criminal justice in particular, they need to protect or promote the trustworthiness of our criminal justice systems. And so we need to make sure that we design AI systems so that they do promote trustworthiness rather than undermine it. So, for example, one concern that people raise about AI systems is they're opaque or they're inscrutable. You can't know exactly why they're making the determinations that they do. Um, and I think one problem with this feature of these systems is that it does call into question their fairness. If you can't dispute the way they make a decision because you don't know how, then you can't dispute unfair treatment. But also, I think the mere opacity of these systems, the inability to sort of understand why they do what they do, I do think it actually undermines the trustworthiness, or it can undermine the trustworthiness of the criminal justice system that uses them. And I think that's a big problem because I think one of the pillars of the legitimacy of our criminal justice system is that it's trustworthy. So anything that undermines its trustworthiness can undermine its legitimacy. Um, so yeah, that's a couple of little tidbits there. I didn't talk much about autonomous weapon systems, but I think that gives you the idea.
Yeah, thank you so much for that, like all of that insight into your research. It was really interesting and really insightful. So now to take a step back and as we conclude, I was just wondering who was your favorite philosopher? Who is your favorite philosopher? Maybe not the one you agree with the most or think have the most in common with, but just who you think was maybe the most impactful or most influential or things like that.
Yeah. Yeah, it's really tough. That's a tough answer. I mean, um, that's a tough question to answer. So I would say that as far as shaping my scholarly career, Derek Parfit was probably the most important or most impactful. So he wrote the book that I didn't show you because I don't think it's actually very friendly reading for like an undergraduate who wants to get into this stuff. But um, he wrote a book called Reasons and Persons, and that book basically laid the groundwork for what became my dissertation and a lot of other people's dissertations. So he was really important in my career. I'm not sure that he's my favorite philosopher, all things considered. Um, I actually think Mike Humer or Michael Humer, um, the guy who wrote this book, Ethical Intuitionism, um, he's up there for being my favorite philosopher simply because his work is so challenging and he argues for so many conclusions that I disagree with, but I'm unsure how to dispute them. Um, and then uh, I would say that as far as applied ethics goes, or practical ethics, which is a lot of what I do, David Boonin at the University of Colorado has to be up there as well. And of course, my dissertation advisor, Alistair Norcross, would feel left out if I didn't include him on that list. But that's just a few folks that I think are have been particularly influential in my career.
Okay, yeah. It's really interesting how like philosophy builds upon itself when people create new innovations and everyone has something new to offer. So thank you for speaking to me today, Professor Purvis.
My pleasure. Yeah, thanks. Yeah, it was fun.
This is really insightful, and I truly appreciate Professor Purvis coming on today. I hope you all enjoyed. Thank you so much for watching.